Welcome to Newsday on the BBC. I'm Sharonjit Lail in Singapore. The headlines. Exactly 50 years on, marking the murder of American civil rights leader Martin Luther King. And a huge mistake, says Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg, admitting data from 87 million people may have been misused.
And Babita Sharma in London, also in the programme. China unveiled its retaliation in the trade dispute with President Trump, but hints that talks are also on the table. And 4,000 athletes from 71 teams get ready as the first day of the Commonwealth Games gets underway.
Live from our studios in Singapore and London. This is BBC World News. It's Newsday.
Good morning. It's 8 a.m. here in Singapore, 1 a.m. in London and 7 in the evening in Memphis, Tennessee. That's where in the last hour, at the exact moment that Martin Luther King died, bells were rung 39 times to mark the number of years that the iconic civil rights activist lived for. Bells also tolled around the U.S. at the same time. Well, let's speak to our correspondent, Neda Tawfik, who was there in Memphis, witnessing that momentous event. Neda, tell us what the feeling was like there on the ground.
Well, I have to say, I would describe it as almost like a pilgrimage of people young and old from here in Memphis and across the country, coming here not to just honor the legacy of Dr. King, but really to recommit themselves to the struggles that he fought against 50 years ago. And so here in Memphis, you had 10,000 people marching, in the name of his legacy, singing songs, rejoicing, and here at the official commemoration in Memphis, there was a mix of performances and, as I say again, celebration, storytelling from icons who were there with him on that night, and also some very passionate speeches from activists and faith leaders talking about the opportunity gap that still exists here in America and all the unfinished business left to realize Dr. King's dream.
That's right, Neda, because obviously, as you say, performances, speeches as well, fiery speeches. We know the Reverend Jesse Jackson is speaking. You've got people like Al Sharpton as well. And what are they saying exactly in terms of what's changed in America in the last 50 years for civil rights for many African Americans?
There's absolutely no doubt that a lot has changed, and those who were here in Memphis back then will tell you that Dr. King took America out of the Jim Crow era. He, made it so that segregation was a thing of the past. He guaranteed voting rights for all, and that, if you just look at the fact that in kind of 40 years from that point, we elected in America the first African American president. That was such a momentous achievement, and you see the black middle class in this country growing, but people here really did focus on what hasn't really changed since then. Dr. Martin Luther King spent the last part of his life fighting poverty, fighting economic injustice that he saw as really stopping African Americans from being equal with white Americans. And so from this podium, they spoke about that. They spoke about the wage gaps. There's a debate here in this country about fair wages for not just fast food workers, but laborers in this country. But they also broadened it out to the other issues that America has been grappling with. Police brutality, and the anti-war stance that Dr. King had so long ago. So it really was interesting to hear from people here how Dr. King shaped their lives, but also what they still saw in America that they needed to themselves now confront.
That's right. Lots of crucial, important messages, Neda. And you're there for this evening. What are we expecting for the rest of the day?
Well, across the country, they have been having commemorations. Of course, here in Memphis, it was the epicenter. People have been coming to the National Civil Rights Museum, where the which is housed now in the Lorraine Motel, where Dr. King was assassinated. And it was so interesting to see people going in there to really learn again about his life and death. And now you can see around me, people are still milling about, still reflecting on the day, taking in what they heard and where to go from here. Because here in Memphis, we've spoken to activists from the Black Lives Matter campaign, to others, and they think it's really important to kind of heed Dr. King's call that silence is the enemy, that they must speak out, they must call out injustice, that the time is ripe to do the right thing. And so that's what we've been hearing from activists, going around trying to get people registered to vote, trying to figure out the next steps. And so you have a lot of that here in Memphis at the moment.
All right, Neda Tawfik there. Thank you so much, live in Memphis for that very momentous occasion of the commemorations for Martin Luther King.
Let's take a look at some of the day's other news. And Britain and its allies have blocked Moscow's request for a joint inquiry involving Russian experts into the poisoning of the former spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter in England a month ago. At an emergency meeting of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, Russia got only 6 votes in favor of its proposal, with 15 against. Russia's delegation complained that the UK investigation won't tell them what they need to know.
We're being told that we will be informed on the results of this investigation only if there is goodwill to do so. However, knowing our British so-called partners, we cannot really count on their goodwill.
Also making news this hour, the US president has agreed to keep American troops in Syria for a little while longer to help in the fight to defeat ISIS, according to a senior administration official. President Trump had signaled his desire to pull them out. There were about 2,000 US troops in Syria. The Duke of Edinburgh has undergone hip replacement surgery at a private hospital in London. In a statement, Buckingham Palace said the Duke, who's 96, was comfortable and in good spirits. Saudi Arabia will open its first cinema in decades in the next 2 weeks. It's part of a deal that the Saudis have done with AMC, the world's largest cinema chain. The plan is to open up to 40 cinemas in some 15 Saudi cities over the next 5 years. Liverpool took a firm grip on their Champions League quarter-final as Manchester City were torn apart pretty much by a 3-goal burst from Jurgen Klopp's side. If you want all the latest Champions League action, head to bbc.com for more. And also this hour, our team will be back with Sport Today.
Now, it's been revealed that as many as 87 million users may have had their personal information shared with the data firm Cambridge Analytica. Within the last few hours, Facebook's chief executive Mark Zuckerberg has been speaking to reporters on a phone call, and he admitted he made a huge mistake and that the company had not done enough to protect people's information. Well, earlier I spoke to Dave Lee, who has details of that call.
Well, it was quite an unusual step for Mark Zuckerberg to be so open in a press conference. Took many questions from several different organisations, including the BBC. But I think that the nub of it, frankly, is that he's defending his position as the head of Facebook. He's, of course, the chief executive and the chairman of the board at Facebook. And when asked directly whether he felt he was the right man to continue doing those jobs, he said yes. He admitted there had been mistakes in the past. Indeed, he said that he'd been too idealistic in terms of trusting third parties when using Facebook data, but he said that he's learned from those mistakes and that going forward it's about accountability and restoring the company's reputation. Many people think this press conference, which was done via a conference call rather than in person, many think this is actually good preparation for some real scrutiny that he'll get next week when he speaks to Congress in Washington. But certainly a more open Mark Zuckerberg than we've been used to seeing recently.
That's right. We're told April 11th is that date when he speaks to Congress. But Dave, what evidence is there that this has truly damaged Facebook as a company? We know the share price has plunged, but is there any sense that users are turning away from it? They're not using it as much, or advertisers are withdrawing ads?
Well, this is the interesting part because, of course, seeing that stock market value tumble would suggest that it is having a huge damaging effect on the company. But that's all about perception, of course. Now, in reality, the company said today, Mr. Zuckerberg said today, that they're not seeing any noticeable effect since this scandal took hold. And by that, he meant both in terms of users on Facebook using the platform and also advertisers. He said quite clearly that they haven't seen a noticeable effect in advertisers not wanting to work with Facebook anymore. And we've heard this in the past. Quite often there'll be movements to delete Facebook, to boycott Facebook, to pull advertising, but the fact is it's still a platform with 2 billion people on it, using it regularly around the world, and that will continue to be useful for both the people on the platform and indeed those who advertise in it. So no noticeable effect on the business of Facebook just yet. However, if there are regulations in the future, that could force some big changes that would have a very real impact indeed.
All right, and as well, Dave, we know that Zuckerberg is obviously going to Congress. He's going to testify next week, but he's sending high-ranking officials to other places around the world to answer to testimony of this, particularly the UK as well. And some of the latest revelation is that 1.1 million UK users were also affected. Is there a sense that perhaps he's shirking his responsibilities elsewhere?
Well, yes, I mean, that's been a criticism of Mr. Zuckerberg in the past. He's managed to avoid any kind of hearing of this nature so far. He is going to speak to 2 panels next week in Washington, as you say, but he's going to send Chris Cox, which is his, they call him his chief of staff informally in Facebook, and also the chief technology officer of Facebook is going to be going around different panels around the world to answer questions that many of those panels wanted to put to Mr. Zuckerberg himself, but he's going to palm off that responsibility to 2 high-ranking members of his team. They certainly know a lot about Facebook, but I think many of those investigations will be disappointed and perhaps angry not to hear from Mark Zuckerberg himself.
And that was Dave Lee speaking to me earlier from San Francisco. Well, you're watching Newsday on the BBC. Still to come on the programme, China responds to Trump's tariffs on Chinese products with its own plans for measures against American exports.
Also coming up on the programme for you, the Commonwealth Games kick off on the Gold Coast in Australia. We'll hear from our correspondent live.
Welcome back. You're watching Newsday on the BBC. I'm Sharonjit Lail in Singapore.
Thanks for joining us. I'm Babita Sharma here in London. Our top stories. African-American leaders have gathered in the US city of Memphis to mark the assassination 50 years ago of the civil rights leader Martin Luther King.
And Facebook has admitted that data on 87 million people may have been used inappropriately by British-based political consultants. Let's take a look now at some of the front pages from around the world now. We can start with the Straits Times, which looks at the Commonwealth Games beginning in Australia. And in fact, we'll be covering that in just a little while. But we've got the reigning Commonwealth Games air pistol champion, To Shun Xie. He's leading the Singapore delegation. Of course, they're represented by 60 athletes in some 11 sports, and wish them well. And in the Japan Times, it's got a cute study on macaque monkeys, because Japanese researchers say that the snow monkeys bathe in hot springs to reduce the stress from the winter cold, a bit like all of us, really. And finally, the New York Times leads on a European story in Hungary. And really, it's about the Prime Minister. He's really seeking re-election, and he started a national workfare program. But residents are sceptical, and they say that in winter, there really isn't work anyway. Well, that's some of the papers for you. Now, Babita, you're covering some stories that have been sparking discussions online.
Yeah, Sharonjit, it's a decision by the Philippine President, Rodrigo Duterte, that's got a lot of people talking online, because he's announced the closing of one of the Philippines' most famous tourist islands, Boracay. A government spokesperson said that there was a need for a major clean-up on the island of what he described as a sewer pool. That's despite its luxury hotels and lively night scene.
And now, if anyone thought China would take Donald Trump's protectionist threats lying down, well, think again. Beijing has announced huge tariffs against US products. It's day 3 of growing trade tensions that are really spooking financial markets and wiping billions from people's pension plans and investments. Well, Robin Brandt reports from Shanghai.
In just 24 hours, both the United States and China have laid out plans to hit each other's exports. The US has a long list, around 1,300 items, including ovens and flamethrowers. The punishment is in response to claims that China has stolen its intellectual property. It's also about the decades-old policy of forcing foreign firms to share their technology when they invest here in China. China, though, is targeting far fewer products, and it looks like it wants to cause more pain. Soybeans, corn, cotton, beef, tobacco are all on the list. Soybean alone is a multi-billion-dollar import business to China. These measures would hit specific farming areas of the US hard. But China insists it doesn't want a trade war.
Frankly speaking, the challenges we're facing today are huge for sure, because of the scale of the trade volumes, as you can see. However, China's stance has been clear-cut. We don't want a trade war, because the result will only be a no-win situation that hurts the interests of China, the United States, and the prospect for global economic development.
Just as significant is the fact that automobiles and aircraft are on the list. Ford sells tens of thousands of cars that it ships here from the US. And Boeing, the aircraft giant, could see its attempts to make further inroads into the domestic China market put on hold if its aircraft fall into the specific categories being targeted. But all this is yet to be acted on, and there's a possibility of a deal, with the US moving last week to extend its consultation period before acting. Whatever happens now, the reality is that none of these tariffs have yet been imposed, and it appears that the US administration is angling for some kind of negotiated settlement. Robin Brandt, BBC News, Shanghai.
Well, President Trump has tweeted that it's not a trade war, but I asked our Asia business correspondent Karishma Vaswani, what is it if not a war?
I think what it is it's a very public negotiation over the terms and conditions of how the world's two largest economies are going to do business with one another from now on. Now, if you look at the tariffs that each side has said it wants to place on products from the other side, they've targeted politically sensitive products. For instance, China targeting agricultural products from the United States. That hits American farmers. And the US targeting products in industries, innovative industries that China says it wants to be a leader in the next decade. But they haven't put these tariffs into place yet. Nothing's gone into effect yet, Sharon. So this is very much a negotiation tactic, and the two sides have actually said that they want to keep talking before any of this actually comes into effect.
Karishma Vaswani there. The Commonwealth Games are getting underway in Australia on the Gold Coast, and the Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall attended the colourful opening ceremony, which featured plenty of Aboriginal motifs. More than 4,000 athletes from 71 different nations and territories are set to compete, and Chris Mitchell is there for us. Chris, how's it going? Day one of the competition. I think the triathlon's underway.
The triathlon is underway behind me. Ashley Gentle of Australia is about a minute behind the leader, Flora Duffy of Bermuda. She's expected to win gold, but that, I'm afraid, is not the story. Really bad and breaking news for the Australian team here in the Gold Coast is that Sally Pearson is expected to pull out of the games within the next couple of hours. She's called a news conference here on Gold Coast with the team doctor, where she's expected to say that she hasn't recovered well enough from her Achilles injury to compete next week at the Athletics. I just want to try to put into context how massive this is in terms of an athletics story, in terms of a blow for the Commonwealth Games in Australia. She was the face of the Games. I've been living here for 12 months now, and you cannot turn on a television set without seeing Sally Pearson on it in some way. Social media too, posters everywhere, on the backs of buses, on the sides of buses. She was, if you like, what Jessica Ennis-Hill was to the 2012 London Games, the face of it, and now she's pulling out. Some may question the timing as well, sorry about that, some may question the timing as well of this pulling out. Yesterday she was heavily involved in the opening ceremony, and perhaps they didn't want to say before to dampen spirits. But why say now? Was she ever ready to compete in these games? These questions will be answered, and I guess in the next couple of hours at this news conference. But the breaking news here is that Sally Pearson, who was going for a hat-trick of gold medals at the Commonwealth Games, a former Olympic champion, a world champion, the current world champion, is out of these games. She was expected to win gold here had she been fully fit, and her story is a tragic one now. In Rio, she had to pull out because of injury. She then dumped her trainer, trained herself to world championship glory last year. She broke her wrist. It's been a real roller coaster ride for her, and now she is on a very bad downslope, you have to say, and the Australian team hit hard here. This will be morale zapping, as Ashley Gentle too will be morale zapping. She was expected to perhaps get a gold here. She won't be doing that either. So in terms of Australia, not a good start to these Commonwealth Games at all.
Yeah, blow for the host nation. Chris, thank you very much for that. Chris Mitchell there on day one of the Commonwealth Games on the Gold Coast.
Now, zoos and other places that house animals remain important to the tourist economy here in Southeast Asia. But what's often less known is the cruelty inflicted on animals in some institutions. Well, award-winning wildlife photographer Aaron Jackowski is looking to expose such cruelty through his work. A winner of this year's Wildlife Photographer of the Year competition run by the British Museum, he recently travelled to Thailand, taking thousands of photos. And I'm delighted to say he joins us now. Welcome to the programme, Aaron, and congratulations on that very prestigious award. Now, you've taken thousands of photos of these animals, and specifically in Thailand. Tell us just how prevalent was the treatment and some of the worst cases you saw?
Well, the wildlife tourism industry is huge business, and every year around 110 million people visit cruel wildlife attractions around the world, and about 500,000 animals are suffering for wildlife tourism. So this is a huge business, and it's something that affects all of us because we have all been to zoos or aquariums at some point. So I decided to explore this issue with my camera, and Thailand is seen as the epicenter of the industry, so that was the first stop on my tour.
That's right. It does appear cruel. We're looking at some of those photos now of an orangutan caged, some tigers caged as well at these zoos. Now, it looks like you've got pretty good access to these zoos. Tell us a little bit about the handlers, the zookeepers you've encountered, and did they realize the impact of their treatment and what they're doing?
Well, actually, the access that I received was just as a tourist, so I just went in the same way that everyone goes to these shows every single day. And a lot of the time, I mean, money talks, and when there is a demand for this, then people will keep supplying it. So the handlers, I didn't actually speak to any of them, so I can't comment on what their views were of the animal welfare and how they're treating them. But whilst there are people still going to these events, they will still happen. The only way that we can stop this and we can stop cruel wildlife tourism is by voting with our feet and not going to some of these places.
Yeah, and some of those pictures are really disturbing, I should say. Tell us, what led you to taking up this project in the first place?
Well, as an environmental photojournalist, I've spent the last decade looking at human-animal conflict around the world. And I've always been very interested in wildlife tourism and some of the negative impacts of that, because a lot of the time we're not aware of some of the abuses that are going on behind closed doors and right in front of our eyes as well. Take the example of elephants in Thailand. Now, to make elephants completely submissive to their handlers, they go through something called the crush. And this is a form of torture designed to make them completely submissive. But I can guarantee you that most people, when they go to ride on the back of an elephant, they have no idea of some of the abuse that's taken place.
So what message are you trying to convey? Are you trying to say to people, no, don't support these industries, they are cruel?
I'm not anti-captivity per se, I'm anti-cruelty. So I believe that there is definitely a part for zoos and for aquariums around the world, but they have to get better at what they're doing, some of them. But, for example, there's a zoo here in Singapore that's fantastic, and there's zoos all over the world that are doing great work for conservation. But there's also ones that are treating animals extremely badly, and in my opinion, that shouldn't be allowed to happen.
All right, Aaron Jackowski there, thank you so much for coming in and talking to us about that very important topic.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us here on Newsday. We'll see you again soon. Goodbye.
On Wednesday, Broad